the legislative leaders are already out front on this issue, right? They've already said this is a good thing to do, and they now look weak in terms of their relationship to the governor.
Hi there, it's WAMC News Director Ian Pickus, and on this episode of the WAMC News Podcast, when will the special election be? The candidates, the voters, and Hakeem Jeffries are among those wondering when New York State will set a special election in the race to replace North Country Congresswoman Elise Stefanik. Stefanik will be leaving to become UN ambassador, but with the narrow GOP majority in the House and state Democrats' apparent urge to keep the seat open for months, it's unclear what will happen next. Joining me to break it down is Capitol Pressroom host David Lombardo of WCNY, who broke the news that the state legislature was considering changing the law around special elections. Dave, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for the plug, Ian. I really appreciate it.
So just remind us of the timeline. This all happened in a matter of days. There was a conversation about a bill, then there was a bill, then there was no bill.
Yeah, so if we can remember far enough back to January 31st, those simpler days, I got a heads up that there was a unscheduled conference. That's when the majority party meets, and this was one for the Assembly and Senate. They were meeting on a Friday, and it turned out that they were considering updating the special election calendar in New York. And right now, the special election calendar is governed by pretty specific laws that set the timelines for when the governor needs to declare a special election and when that special election needs to be held. Well, nothing ended up emerging from those initial conversations on January 31st, except a recognition by the Democratic majorities that, yes, we are considering that. Well, fast forward to the first week of February 7th, and they met again. And this time, they did produce a bill, and they had a concrete legislation that was dropped late Friday. And this time, the Democratic majorities in both houses of the legislature were prepared to talk about that bill to a certain degree. And we had a proposal on what the new calendar might look like now, written down in concrete terms.
Then, by Monday, there were some press conferences by Republicans blasting the idea. The Congressman Mike Lawler, who is expected to run for governor, said it was a RICO case and should be investigated. Then there was no vote. So what happened?
So as soon as that bill dropped, the pushback really started pushing, I guess, for lack of a better expression. We reached out to the majority leader in the Senate, Andrea Stewart-Cousins, her office, as well as Assembly Speaker Carl Heastie's office to get comments, and they were explaining to us why they supported it. But we were also reaching out to the Senate Republican leader, and they gave a fiery statement about what the problem was here, and that just sort of cascaded. It was like a snowball, and as more people became aware of it, more opposition mounted, including some within the Democratic Party, largely from Assembly members whose districts overlap with the 21st Congressional District, currently represented by Elise Stefanik. And it clearly, as we can get to, became something that grabbed the attention of the White House.
And we should say, at this point, there is a Democratic candidate chosen for this race. There is not a Republican candidate. So a lot of the potential candidates also had a chance to weigh in.
Yeah, including Assemblymember Chris Tague. He's a Republican from Schoharie County. He's pursuing the nomination, so to speak. I'd say really
the designation
of the committee chairs. Yeah, because it's an interesting process. But I think what ultimately moved the state lawmakers not to bring this up was Governor Kathy Hochul, who was seemingly swayed by her efforts to negotiate some other issues with the Republican White House and President Donald Trump.
Now, just as we're speaking, Governor Hochul was asked an interesting question by one of our colleagues in New York City, which is, hey, she won a special election for Congress back in 2011. Would it have been better if there had been longer run-up to that race? And here's what she had to say.
Hell yes. That was an awfully short time frame to have to run an election in 7 counties. more time is very helpful for voters to get to know someone. I was known in one county out of 7. So I would just say there's a whole process, even the idea of having individuals not selected to a primary system. I mean, other states are doing it differently. Other states actually, 15 states allow up to 669 days to fill a vacancy, which is obscenely long. I wouldn't support that.
So there's some different conversations happening here. One reportedly between Hochul and Hakeem Jeffries, the House Minority Leader, and then another conversation between Hochul and President Trump over congestion pricing. It seems like the two are related.
They're definitely related, but I want to come back to what the governor was just talking about and these timelines for elections and her trying to make a case that, sure, you should have more time for elections. And you know what? Why don't we think about how we choose these candidates for special elections? This is not the first special election in New York. We had seats that had to get filled for Congress in 2024 on Long Island to replace George Santos, in Western New York to replace Brian Higgins. And no one at that time was saying, hey, why don't we wait until November when we could have more people participating, and it would cost the counties less money to administer these elections. And that sort of highlights that there is a blatant political thought process here that Democrats are, one, writing off the special election because if they thought that they could win it with smaller turnout, which is likely what you'd have in a special election, then we would be proceeding as planned. But there is a recognition from both sides of the aisle that this is a seat that will be in Republican hands, whether it's a special election this spring, this summer, or in November. So that's one of the reasons why, they're not necessarily changing the calendar for that purpose. And this idea that we should be changing how we choose these candidates. I stumbled over my words earlier with how to describe Chris Tague. That's because special election candidates are chosen by county leaders within that district, as opposed to a primary, which is what good government groups want. They want a selection process that is not driven by political insiders. That is not part of this bill here. This reform, so to speak, is solely limited to time, and that's why it's really seen as a brazen political move. I believe Senate Minority Leader Robert Ortt, in addition to brazen, called it craven.
The spokesperson for the Assembly Speaker, Carl Hastie, responding to Tague, said that it was meant to save money and get better turnout. So I take it you don't give that argument too much truck.
I think they are correct that this would drive up turnout and it would save money, but it's not like, as I pointed out, they are suddenly aware of both of these factors with special elections. This is something they could have done in previous special elections and chose not to. So to say that you are currently motivated by those cost saving and turnout concerns seems disingenuous to me. And I know that you would think that politicians and their spokespeople would be telling it to you straight 24/7 and really just wearing their heart on their sleeve, but sometimes you have to look for ulterior motives.
What do you think about the argument that, and I've heard a few people make it, that Democrats have so few cards to play right now, and Republicans in Washington have done much the same? Merrick Garland is not on the Supreme Court, and so they should be playing like this because the Republicans haven't been playing by the rules of late either.
Yeah, I wouldn't put a value judgment on what Republicans have done in the past and what Democrats have done in the past, or what Republicans are doing now, what Democrats are doing now. But I would say from a Machiavellian perspective and a Machiavellian only perspective, there is a critique to be made against Democrats that they have not used all the bullets in their gun, so to speak, that they have unilaterally disarmed in a lot of situations. And I think this is kind of similar in the sense that the governor has basically preempted this conversation by directing the legislative leaders, according to good reporting by my colleagues at the Capitol, from even bringing this up as an issue. I mean, it's one thing to pass a bill. It's another thing to pass a bill and wait to sign it. It's another thing to pass a bill, wait to sign it, and then wait to actually implement it. Because this bill really gives the governor flexibility to choose when the special election is going to be. So this idea of just stopping the bill in its tracks in order to ensure you're on good terms with other issues seems to me like putting the safety on your gun, if I'm going to stick with these firearm metaphors, when you really could put one in the chamber, so to speak, and pass the bill now and be ready to fire if needed.
There's also the fact that Republicans, as I mentioned, have such a narrow majority that Stefanik may be in the seat for a while as other states' special elections are held, and she might not be resigning until April, we hear.
Yeah, and under the existing calendar, if Stefanik was to resign in April, the governor would have 10 days to schedule a special election, and it would have to be held not less than 70 days, but not more than 80 days from the time of that proclamation. So at that point, we're talking May, June, July, something, in early July potentially. We're talking about the summer with a special election. And if we were not to follow that calendar, if this bill was to become a law, then we're talking about really 6 months of a vacancy as opposed to just three. And we're talking about more than 700,000 constituents in that district. So there'd be a lot of people without a voice in their Congress. I would say, though, we'd probably see a lot of their staff continue constituent services. And so you'd still be able to have someone to call for your social security check or questions about your mail and other federal issues. But these people would be without a representative for an extended period if the governor was to sign this bill into law and to exercise its full powers.
What do you think will
Whenever, I
happen
think.
now?
Well, I didn't think this was going to happen. So I'm not sure what'll happen next because the legislative leaders are already out front on this issue, right? They've already said this is a good thing to do, and they now look weak in terms of their relationship to the governor. And I think they also are probably mad at the governor for putting them out front on this issue, only to have it backfire in the sense that they're told not to do anything. So I think we're probably in a holding pattern. I don't think they're going to pass this unilaterally. I don't think they're going to show up the governor. Does that spill over then into other issues when there's negotiations with the governor? Maybe. None of this is done in a vacuum, so I have to imagine that if I'm Senate Majority Leader Andrew Stewart Cousins, if I'm Assembly Speaker Carl Hastie, I'm thinking about this whole snafu when I'm in a room with the governor and we're trying to negotiate other issues.
You would think that an issue of this consequence and controversy for something like this, they would have their ducks in a row before the bill gets introduced. I mean, you would just expect that that would be the case. At least I would. Am I naive?
Well, they're doing a lot of this on the fly, so to speak, because they need to make sure that they have all the votes for this. And I think that the public outcry from the Democrats in the assembly who represent parts of the North Country is just a fraction of the opposition that we're seeing. I think we should think of it like an iceberg. They are the tip of the iceberg and we can see them because they're over the water. But I have to imagine behind the scenes, under the water, so to speak, if you like that metaphor better, there is additional opposition that we aren't probably cognizant of. People who also don't care about this and don't want to spend time or political capital on it. So I think that's what conference was about at the end of January and early February was to get all these ducks in a row, to address concerns that people have, and to also flesh out the legislation. Because what we originally heard was that they were considering a consolidation of special elections, not just for the general, but potentially for primary day in June. And what finally emerged was a language that would require the special elections to be held basically as they are now or in November and not allowing for a consolidation in June. And we asked the Senate Majority Leader staff about that focus, November versus the primaries, and they basically made that turnout argument and said, well, not everybody has a special election. And that's the reason they're going with. I mean, I don't think there would have been political repercussions in New York for passing this bill. I don't think voters were going to head to the polls in November and say, all things being equal, I'm actually voting out my Democratic state senator or assembly member because they changed the special election calendar in New York. It reminds me of 2022 when Democrats updated the election law to essentially kick Brian Benjamin off the Democratic ticket and get Antonio Delgado on the ticket. And I remember talking to one of my colleagues at the time who was scandalized by this and was maybe drinking too much of the GOP and good government Kool-Aid and thought this was going to be an issue in 2022 come November. And I said, if this is one of the top 5 things that is motivating voters, I would be shocked. And we never heard from it again. And I think the same would be true here. There's no real political repercussion from voters. I think the repercussion is what we're seeing the governor be concerned about. What will the federal government, or what will President Donald Trump more specifically do if this was to become a law?
And I mean, it's clearly an administration that is focused on retribution and slights. So, no, I mean, I wouldn't want to kick that hornet's nest.
Yeah, President Donald Trump has demonstrated more so than any other president in modern times to be a transactional leader. And I think there is a case to be made that by unilaterally disarming, maybe you are getting into the good graces of the president. But at the same time, I think it could be seen as weakness, because this is not a guy who unilaterally disarms. This is a guy who goes to the brink with every issue and then gets resolved. So I don't know whether anyone's getting a lot of street cred or actual credit for stopping this legislation in its tracks.
That's Dave Lombardo, host of the Capitol Pressroom show and podcast from WCNY. Dave, thanks for your insights and reporting.
Thank you, Ian, for letting me talk for so long.
Okay, that does it for this episode of the WAMC News Podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, I'm Ian Pickus.